self-determination, his argument was picked up by Marcus Garvey. As a matter of fact, when Garvey came from Jamaica, he said that of all of the leaders in America, Booker T. Washington was the only one that had any sense, because he was the one who was trying to understand white supremacy and apartheid the way it was. So Garvey picked it up in 1916, and then he got accused of mail fraud and was put in prison in Atlanta. But before that happened, he organized one of the largest movements in the history of our people. I think he mobilized about 6 million people as a part of his organization, Universal Negro Improvement Association. When Garvey was taken off the scene in 1928, on the heels of Garvey came another man, actually two people. One was Noble Drew Ali with the Moorish Science Temple, and then the other one was Farad Muhammad, who came in 1930. And so what they did, you went from Booker T. Washington to Marcus Garvey, and from that, then the Islamic nationalism came out in those two movements, the Moorish Science Temple, Noble Drew Ali, and then the Nation of Islam with Farad Muhammad, and later Elijah Muhammad, who picked it up from Farad Muhammad.
That's interesting.
Yes, and then of course with the civil rights movement, then out of that came, Martin Luther King and A. Philip Randolph with the pulling the Carlos Porter. So you had these two movements, and eventually we come to the point where Malcolm and Martin come on the scene in the mid-1950s. Malcolm being associated with his Mosque No. 7 in Harlem, and Martin Luther King coming on the stage at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, and then later he went to Ebenezer there in Atlanta. So when those two men came on the scene, the gap between the two was getting narrower and smaller. So we started out with the two extremes: either assimilate here as a domestic strategy, or repatriate back to Africa. Most people didn't want that. So now you deal with integration versus separation. And then in the case of Martin and Malcolm, it was separation versus integration. But Elijah Muhammad was not like Marcus Garvey. He did not necessarily want to go back to Africa. He was pushing more an idea of reparations. He wanted the United States government to give African Americans some arable states in the South mainly, 2 or 3 states, so that he could develop a nation within a nation. Of course, that was utopian thinking, because a civil war was fought when the Southerners broke away from the Union, but that never happened. So he was pushing a philosophy of reparation for the pain and suffering of slavery, separation from whites because they didn't want to integrate, and then self-determination, economic self-determination. So he was more or less embraced Booker T. Washington economic agenda. When Martin Luther King came along, the dominant civil rights movement was the NAACP.